time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have back with us live in the studios this morning, Kshama Sawant. Kshama Sawant is Seattle City Council member representing District 4. Kshama, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Mike, but it's District 3, though.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So start out, it has been a very busy week at City Hall, certainly in terms of proposed local tax initiative, the EHT. Can you give us some history as to how we got to this point with the employee head tax?
Well, it's not going to be any surprise to your listeners who live in the Seattle area that we're having a massive crisis in the shortage of affordable housing and the exploding homelessness. In the last decade, the rents in the Seattle area have grown by 65%, and the median home price is now over $800,000. So in other words, what we have seen is the price of affordable housing, the price of housing going up to such a degree that people are being forced out of the city that they work in. So in other words, we're seeing people move farther and farther away from their places of work. And keep in mind, Seattle, like every other city, is not run on a daily basis by billionaires. It's run by hundreds of thousands of working people going to work every single day. But it's those same working people, including the middle class, who are facing an acute crisis in affordability. And not to mention those of us who've already been pushed into homelessness. There's now increasingly people who have experienced at least bouts of homelessness. We have 4,000 kids in the Seattle public schools who are facing bouts of homelessness. This is an absolute scandal if you think about the kind of society we want to live in. And really, and I want to talk about the tax in a second, but I wanted to frame that in the context of what this question really is about. It's not just about taxes or housing. It's about who gets to occupy urban spaces in America today. Because what we're seeing is a housing crisis, not just in Seattle, but we're seeing this in every metropolitan area around the nation. We're seeing it in Vancouver, BC. We're seeing it in London and every other city in the world as well. So what we have on our hands is this massive inequality that is growing even greater under capitalism, and that manifesting itself in the question of housing affordability. That is why it is absolutely urgent that we do something about it, and that's the genesis behind looking to raise progressive revenues to build permanently affordable, publicly owned housing. And it's important to emphasize publicly owned because all this faith in the market has completely failed us. We know that the market is not going to deliver us out of this crisis. As a matter of fact, relying on the market has made the crisis even more, even sharper, because all that's happened with all this construction boom in Seattle is that more and more homes are being built that are only affordable to the richest amongst us, and the city has become a playground for the rich. So where do you go for the money to build this housing? Do you go to the working people of Seattle who are in a state with the most regressive tax system in the nation? Do you go to small businesses who, as it is, struggle to maintain a foothold? No, you go to big business that hasn't paid anything close to its fair share towards this city's survival. So it means taxing Amazon and corporations like Amazon, the top 3 to 5%, so that we can raise $150 million every year, which would allow us to build up to 750 permanently affordable publicly owned units with union labor and priority hire agreements, meaning apprenticeship programs for the kids who live in this city. And it would allow us to greatly expand homeless services.
So there was 2 hearings about this week. One was a Monday night, a public forum where the public was invited in. And then there was a follow-up on Wednesday where council began to hammer out some of the ideas around the proposed legislation. Is that right?
It is right, but if I might talk about it a little bit, on Monday we had a public hearing on the tax on big business to fund affordable housing and homeless services. In other words, the employee hours tax, or as you said correctly, Mike, EHT. And on Wednesday, there was a committee meeting to discuss the details of that law. But, I think while it's enough maybe in some ways to say just that and leave it at that, I would go a little bit beyond just the superficial details to go into what actually happened at these meetings. Because what happened at these two meetings and juxtaposing them against each other really contains a narrative that is important for us to understand how we can win social change. Because first of all, just to give a little bit of a context to your listeners who haven't been part of our ongoing struggle, but who support it, who would agree with us for what we are doing, the reality is that we are not at this point where the council is on the cusp of voting on this tax because the majority of the council members agreed with ordinary working people and really, really want to alleviate the dire situation that they're facing. The reality is that the city council, just like the mayor's office, is occupied by by politicians who primarily represent the interests of big business. So it's not that they advocated for this tax. It was the movement of ordinary people, renters, housing activists, through the People's Budget Movement last year, the Housing for All Coalition, the Affordable Housing Alliance, which is also a coalition that works with Housing for All. And it was basically activists on the ground, including from Socialist Alternative, from Democratic Socialists of America, the Tenants Union, and many other organizations, grassroots organizations. And we fought in the People's Budget last fall to stop the sweeps of homeless encampments and for this tax. But you know what happened last November, which was only months ago? The majority of the council voted against this tax, and they voted against the Stop the Sweeps legislation. So what we are seeing now, and this is an important lesson, what we're seeing now, only a few months later, with the council being at the cusp of voting on this shows the power of building organized movements and organized resistance, because the same council, made up of the same politicians who opposed it, pretty much the same council who opposed this tax only months ago, are now talking about voting for it because they are feeling pressured by a growing movement that is defiant and that is refusing to accept the status quo, and that is calling the politicians out for their loyalties. Where do your loyalties lie? Do your loyalties lie with Amazon, or do they lie with working people who are struggling to sustain themselves on a day-to-day basis? So what you saw on Monday was a hearing that was chaired by Councilmember Sally Bagshaw with big business in full gear. We had the Chamber of Commerce, we had the Downtown Seattle Association, we had a spokesperson from Vulcan, which is a big business development corporation and owned by Paul Allen, and we had a spokesperson from Safeway, which is owned by the huge chain called Albertsons. All of them said two things. One, that they can't afford to pay this tax, and second, that this is a tax on jobs. Both are lies. And then our movement, in order to exert our power in the public hearing, we started chanting between speakers. We were saying housing is a human right. So do you know what? After listening very politely and respectfully to the big business representatives, Sally Bagshaw then decided she is going to turn her wrath on the ordinary people who were there. And keep in mind that included homeless people, that included women of color, that included young LGBTQ people who are struggling with homelessness, and many dozens of activists who've been fighting so diligently and sincerely. She decided that it was wrong of us to chant housing is a human right. She decided that was disruptive. And the second time we chanted between speakers, she threw us all out. And I say us because I'm not separate from the movement. And when she decided to take that action, I completely disagreed with her. I spoke about it, and I walked out with the movement. We were outside the locked doors. Can you imagine how undemocratic this approach is, where the public is thrown out of a public hearing? I had a lot of people come up to me and say, how can this even be happening? How can you throw the public out of the public hearing? But the reality is that it gave the movement a chance to show what happens when we fight back, which is that we can win. So in other words, the movement refused to go away. The movement refused to accept her idea that only 10 people at a time would be allowed in. We said, that's not a public hearing if you're just allowing a limited number of people inside chambers. So instead of accepting the establishment, this is not about just Councilmember Bagshaw, this is about the establishment. Instead of accepting this this completely unacceptable approach to how the public hearing should be conducted, we stood outside the doors and kept chanting, "Let us in," and tax Amazon. We never relented. And it was ultimately to save face for the establishment that other council members said, you know what, we need to let the public in, because they understood that this was going to be completely disgraceful and shameful for the establishment and complete loss of face to allow the movement to dominate like this. But we did end up dominating because we all came in together and we all resoundingly spoke in favor of the tax and against big business. Now, Wednesday, 2 days later, we had another meeting, as you said, a committee meeting. At that meeting, people were not able to mobilize. So who ended up dominating that hearing? It was Councilmember Bagshaw and Councilmember Harrell, who are both, as far as I know, opposed to the tax because they were amongst those who voted no, as I said, in November. And what we had was not a discussion on details of the tax. What we had was council members using up time to make the meeting boring and asking asinine questions like, what is a housing unit? Is it an apartment? I mean, these are not questions because any individual politician is too stupid. No, they're very smart. This is a conscious tactic that is used by the establishment to make meetings boring. Because when you make meetings boring, you make politics inaccessible to ordinary people. It is when people mobilize to City Hall and really exert their voices and chanting is part of that you really you have the ability to exert pressure on City Hall, and a City Hall dominated by corporate politicians. And as one speaker at the public hearing said, Amazon and those corporations don't need to come and chant. They don't even need to come to the public hearing. They don't need to write letters. They don't need to publish leaflets and stand outside at tables and get people to come to city council hearings. They don't need to do any of that because they have so much political clout that they have many of these politicians in their back pockets. That is why it has to be understood that the movement exerting its own its own existence, its own ability to organize is absolutely critical, because without that, we wouldn't even be here.
It was interesting in watching the video of Monday's forum, and it looked like the first 10 or 12 speakers were very pro big business. In fact, it's interesting how they must have been waiting forever to get on that list.
Yes, they have the time. The Marilyn Strickland, who used to be the mayor of Tacoma and is now the spokesperson for the Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce, she has the time to come hours before. Working people don't. They barely come on time because they have to hold down jobs. Speaking of jobs, there was a couple of those people who spoke that specifically said that, hey, we're a big union outfit. We have a lot of union workers, as if the business itself had been integral in bringing the union into their business. Yes, that was the spokesperson. I think that was Sarah Osborne, the spokesperson for Safeway, which is owned by Albertsons. Yes, you're absolutely right. She talked about the unionized workers as if Safeway had welcomed the union into the workplace. As a matter of fact, it was the union, UFCW, that obviously historically, if you look at the historical record, they fought to unionize retail grocery workers. And it was the fact that the workers are unionized was used disingenuously by the Safeway spokesperson to say, to peddle this mythology that this is a tax on jobs, and that if you implement this tax, you're going to negatively impact unionized workers because we're going to have to close down stores because our profit margins are so thin. First of all, just speaking as an economist, it is not true that this is a tax on jobs. Plain and simple. This is a lie. It is reminiscent to me of the lies that big business used to peddle during the Fight for 15 in 2014. When we were fighting for a $15 an hour minimum wage, big business went around saying, well, you can't pass this because it's actually going to hurt the very people you want to help, because if you increase the wages, then we're going to have to lay people off. And then, what's going to happen? How does that help? And in fact, Dick's Hamburgers was actually peddling a really bad lie where they said that if you if you tax us, then we're going to have to let go people of color and young people, workers, and it's going to hurt the most vulnerable, the very people you're trying to help. But what happened after we fought for $15 an hour? Has there been any economic apocalypse because of the wage increase? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, even the head of the former head of the Washington Restaurant Association himself said that because of the wage increases in Seattle, what had happened was that the restaurants outside Seattle on the periphery were forced to consider increasing wages because they were now competing for workers who were able to get higher wage jobs in Seattle. So in other words, all of this is mythology that, this is a tax on jobs. This is the kind of lie big business will say because they don't want to pay that tax. So let me give you some facts. Amazon, which is one of the major corporations that will be paying this tax. And keep in mind, this is not a tax on small business. And as a matter of fact, big business tried to bring in a tax on small businesses through something called the skin in the game, that small businesses should have a skin in the game. Our movement and my office ferociously opposed the skin in the game. And I have no doubt in my mind that ultimately the draft legislation that we have does not have a tax on small businesses precisely because our movement fought against it. And we said that small businesses and working people should not be paying for this. Amazon and big corporations like Amazon should be paying for this. So let's look at some of the facts about Amazon. Amazon made $5.6 billion of profit, not revenue, profit last year. Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, is now the wealthiest man in the world with $100 billion of wealth. I mean, that is just incomprehensible. Do people know what $100 billion even looks like? I mean, it is incomprehensible levels of wealth. And the IRS in 2016 found that Amazon had not revealed a lot of the tax relevant information in their taxes and ordered Amazon to pay over $1 billion in deferred taxes or back taxes, so-called back taxes. But late last year, Trump and the Republicans gave a $1.8 trillion corporate tax, handout to big business. This is a whopping historic corporate handout. And through this handout, through a grandfather clause in this handout, Amazon now does not have to pay back $789 million of those deferred taxes. So we're talking about a corporation that can not only afford to pay the tax we're talking about, it is pocket change for these corporations.
So it also brought up a couple times by the first dozen or so people who spoke that there was a reasonable platform that you could follow, and that was working with one table. Can you briefly touch on why that is a good or bad thing?
Yeah, One Table is this so-called regional initiative that basically is composed of regional politicians. So the Mayor Durkin sits on one table with the stated idea that this cannot just be a Seattle solution because it's not a Seattle problem, it's a region-wide problem. Now, on the face of that sounds completely accurate and reasonable. As an economist, I would agree, this is not just a Seattle problem, this is a regional problem, because when you see housing prices exploding, it doesn't, housing prices don't observe city borders in any strict way. That housing crisis spills over. In fact, now Somali activists are talking about how the immigrant-owned small businesses in Tukwila are finding it hard to remain in Tukwila. So there's no doubt that this problem has spilled over far and wide. What's completely dishonest about One Table is the class composition of that body and the solutions that they are putting forward. What they have said is no taxes on big business and not really raising any real revenues, but solving the problem. In other words, to quote one of the speakers who's an Amazon tech worker himself and making a good salary, who spoke passionately for the tax at our public hearing, tax on Amazon, he said that if you have business owners and business representatives who say that, yes, the problem is getting worse. I agree, homelessness and affordable housing problem is getting worse. Yes, I agree, we need to do more. And hence my conclusion is that we need to raise less revenues from big business. He says they're just not good at math. The best thing you can say about them is that they're weak at math. And the worst thing, of course, and the truest thing about them is that their loyalties, their political loyalties are aligned with big business. So in other words, if we hold our breath for one table or, corporate dominated politics anywhere at any level to solve this problem, that's not going to happen. That is why ordinary working people have to fight for themselves. And that is the only reason we are at the cusp of winning this tax.
And in fact, there was a local businesswoman who, I quote, she did the math, she made the connection. She said, direct correlation between the pooling of wealth at the top and our housing crisis. So it sounds like there are some business people out there that do get that relationship.
A lot of small businesses have actually supported this tax. The owner of a coffee shop on 23rd and Union in the Central District, Squirrel Chops, which is a woman and LGBTQ.
That's the person who spoke.
Yeah, Shirley Henderson. No, she's been an amazing spokesperson for this issue. She happens to be this very unique combination of being a business owner and a socialist. She's a member of Socialist Alternative, and she has said very clearly over and over again that this is not a tax on small businesses and that big business should pay. And as a matter of fact, small businesses struggle to survive. But the reason they struggle to survive is not because workers are demanding too much. It's because capitalism as a system favors big business. It favors consolidated corporations. It does not favor your neighborhood coffee shop. This whole idea of, the mom and pop capitalism is a total myth. It was invented to get ordinary people to buy into the capitalist system and, feel like, I'm going to benefit from this. And so, as Shirley Henderson said, that's not going to happen, and that there's a direct correlation between the siphoning off of the wealth at the top and the expanding problems that we're seeing at the bottom. It's not an unfortunate coincidence that Jeff Bezos has $100 billion and many of us are facing homelessness. That's not an unfortunate coincidence. That's a direct causal link between the two things. And as a matter of fact, there is a direct causal link between increasing rents and homelessness. There was a study from the Journal of Urban Affairs recently, nationwide study, and as I said, it's not a Seattle-only problem. It's an American problem now, homelessness and affordable housing crisis. This study found that nationwide, for every $100 increase in the median rent, you see a double-digit increase in homelessness. And how much increase exactly depends on which region you're talking about. So in other words, for every $100 increase in rent, you're seeing homelessness explode by 15%, 20%, in some cases 60%. So it's no surprise that we are having a homelessness crisis, and it's completely wrong. And I know most of the people who are listening to this agree with me. It is completely wrong to say that if you've become homeless, it's because something you did wrong. Like, you became, involved in things that ruined your life, and somehow you're responsible alone. No, homelessness and the crisis in affordable housing is a social problem. And as a society, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of city do we want Seattle to be? Do we want Seattle to be a playground for the wealthy? Or do we want it to be a city that is truly welcoming to all? I mean, after Trump was elected, you had Democrat after Democrat saying, I want my city to be welcoming for all. Yes, but how is it going to be welcoming if the very people who make the city run can't afford to live here and are facing a daily problem, not just of survival in general, but imagine the commutes and the traffic snarls that people have to face every single day because they are pushed farther and farther away from their place of work.
So just about 2 minutes left. So you discussed the legislation a bit on Wednesday. Why would one not expect it to be watered down between last Wednesday and the other two hearings about it later in the month?
We should absolutely not expect that it wouldn't be watered down, or at least that attempts would be made. When we were fighting for 15, there were a lot of people who, progressive leaders who were fighting for $15 an hour. Once the legislation went into City Hall, they said they were urging me, Socialist Alternative, 15 Now, all the grassroots activists to stop fighting, because it was time, apparently, according to them, it was time to be nice to the politicians, nice to city council, and, because they were going to pass this, they've promised us they're not going to mess with it, it's going to be as is, it's going to be passed as is. We correctly recognize that is absolutely not going to be the case, that the city council would push for loopholes as much as they could. And what happened was not only that they pushed for loopholes, they were ferocious about the way they pushed for loopholes. I remember at that time, Councilmember Sally Clark also pushing for a gratuitously cruel loophole where rather than going into effect in January, it was going to go into effect in April. And I remember saying, oh my God, you want to deny 3 to 4 months of wage increases to workers? To what end? To what end? This is gratuitous. And it was only because 15 Now did not agree with the analysis that we were done fighting, that we kept fighting till the very end, and it was appropriate that we did because of our fighting, we did not succeed in keeping every loophole at bay, but we did succeed in defeating some of the worst loopholes, which would have truly weakened the legislation. So we have to remember the lessons of that a struggle and note that this time around it will be the same. If we stop mobilizing, then we will not succeed in pushing back against loopholes. Let me mention a very key loophole that I found out only on Wednesday, that apparently some council member, I don't know who, is going to push for a so-called sunset clause, meaning this tax would end after 5 years. This is a really insidious amendment that would come in, and it will succeed if we don't push back. So I really urge everybody who's watching this, please join me on May 9th, that is a Wednesday, at 2 p.m. at the committee hearing, because we absolutely need everybody who believes that we need to fight for a Seattle that's welcoming for all. We're going to have to fight for it. So if you share my vision for Seattle, then you got to fight for it with me. So join me on Wednesday, May 9th at 2 p.m. at Seattle City Hall.
All right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you for coming and spending time with us again.
Thank you for having me.